Imagine living through betrayal, loss, illness, humiliation, and uncertainty, yet never becoming a prisoner of complaint. The Stoics believed that every complaint was a surrender of power, and what they discovered about the human mind may completely change how you see your own struggles. There is a strange comfort in complaining. It feels like release, like setting down a heavy bag after a long walk. We complain about the weather, about traffic, about people who don't understand us, about the unfairness of life. And in the moment, it feels good. It feels like we are doing something about our pain. But what if that very feeling, that small flicker of relief, was actually the thing keeping us trapped? What if the Stoics, 2,000 years ago, discovered something about the human mind that modern psychology is only now beginning to confirm? What if the very habit that feels like a release valve is in truth a slow leak that drains away your power one sigh at a time? This is not a story about ancient men in togas speaking in riddles. This is a story about you. About the moment you sat in traffic and felt your blood begin to boil. About the time a friend misunderstood your intentions and you replayed the conversation in your head for hours. About the quiet resentment that builds when life seems to favor everyone except you. The Stoics lived through all of this and worse. They lived through plagues, wars, exile, slavery, betrayal by friends, and the deaths of their own children. And yet, when you read their words, you find something startling, an almost eerie calm. Not because they didn't feel pain, they were not robots, and they were not pretending. They felt everything a human being feels, but they discovered something about the relationship between an event and a reaction, something most people never stop to examine. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. By the end of this journey, you will understand why a Roman emperor, a former slave, and a wealthy statesman all arrived at the same conclusion, that complaining is not just a habit, but a quiet act of self-betrayal. And you will understand exactly how to stop. But to get there, we have to start where most of us live every single day, in the small, sharp irritations that make up an ordinary life. Picture a man named Epictetus. Before he was a philosopher, before students traveled across the ancient world to sit at his feet, he was property. He was born into slavery in a small town in what is now Turkey, and as a young man he was taken to Rome, where he belonged to a wealthy and often cruel master. According to accounts passed down through history, his leg was permanently injured during his time as a slave. Some say through abuse, some say through illness left untreated. Either way, Epictetus spent the rest of his life walking with a limp. He had every reason by any modern standard to be the most bitter man in Rome. He had been stripped of his freedom, his body had been damaged, and his future had been decided for him by other people before he was old enough to have a say in it. And yet, somehow, Epictetus became one of the most influential teachers of inner peace the world has ever known. How does a man who has lost everything, his freedom, his health, his choices, end up teaching others how to be free? The answer to that question is the thread that runs through this entire story. And it begins with a single, simple idea that Epictetus returned to again and again. There are things in life that are within your control, and there are things that are not. And almost all human suffering comes from confusing the two. Think about that for a moment. Your leg can be broken by someone else's hand. Your reputation can be damaged by someone else's words. Your business can be destroyed by forces entirely outside your influence. A market crash, a global pandemic, a competitor with deeper pockets. None of these things are yours to control. But how you respond to them, that is yours. That has always been yours. Epictetus discovered that even when every external freedom had been taken from him, this one freedom remained completely intact, untouched and untouchable. No master, no chain, no injury could reach it. Now here's where it gets interesting. Most people, when they hear this idea for the first time, nod along and think, sure, that makes sense, and then they go back to complaining about their commute the very next morning. Why? Because understanding an idea intellectually and living it are two completely different things. The gap between knowing and doing is where almost everyone gets stuck. And the Stoics knew this gap existed, which is why they didn't just teach philosophy as a set of abstract ideas. They taught it as a daily practice, almost like exercise for the mind. Marcus Aurelius, the most powerful man in the known world, wrote himself reminders every single night, not because he didn't understand Stoic philosophy, but because understanding fades and practice is what remains. But there was one lesson the Stoics understood that most people still miss today, and it has to do with the very first moment a complaint forms in your mind, the half second before the words even leave your mouth. Let's step into an ordinary morning. The alarm goes off too early. The shower runs cold for the first 30 seconds. The coffee machine takes longer than it should. And then the moment so many of us know intimately: traffic. Brake lights stretching endlessly into the distance, a sea of red taillights under a gray sky, and somewhere deep in the chest, a tightening, a tension that says, why does this always happen to me? Why today when I'm already running late? The radio host mentions the weather, and it's raining. Of course it's raining, because some days seem to conspire against us. By the time we reach work, we've already complained 3 or 4 times, quietly in our own heads, or out loud to no one in particular. And the strange thing is, none of it changed anything. The traffic didn't move faster because we were annoyed. The rain didn't stop because we sighed about it. And yet, almost every human being on the planet does this every single day, often without even noticing. Now picture a very different morning. Almost 2,000 years ago, in a tent on a frozen, muddy battlefield somewhere along the Danube River. An aging man, his joints aching from years of travel and war, wakes before dawn. He has the power to command armies, to decide the fate of nations, to live in unimaginable luxury in marble palaces back in Rome. Instead, he is here, in the cold, dealing with disease outbreaks among his troops, political betrayals whispered about in distant corridors of power, and a body that is slowly failing him. This is Marcus Aurelius, Emperor of Rome. And before he does anything else that day, he picks up a small notebook and begins to write, not for anyone else to read, but for himself. He reminds himself that today he will meet people who are jealous, ungrateful, arrogant, dishonest, and difficult. He reminds himself that this is simply what people are like, and that being surprised by it would be like being surprised that lemons are sour. He's not writing this because he is naive about human nature. Quite the opposite. He has seen betrayal up close from people he trusted. He has buried multiple children. He has ruled during one of the worst plagues in Roman history, one that may have killed millions across the empire, possibly including members of his own family. He knows better than almost anyone in history how cruel and chaotic life can be. And yet, his solution is not to complain about it. His solution is to prepare for it, calmly, deliberately, almost like a soldier checking his armor before battle. He's not telling himself that everything will be fine. He's telling himself that whatever happens, he has the inner resources to meet it without being destroyed by it. This is the difference between the man stuck in traffic and the emperor on the battlefield. It is not that one of them has an easier life. By almost any measure, Marcus Aurelius's life was harder, heavier, and far more dangerous than the average commuter's morning. The difference is in what happens in the half second after the difficulty arrives. Because hidden behind every complaint is something most people never notice. A complaint is not actually a response to what happened. It is a response to what we believed should have happened instead. The traffic itself is neutral. It is simply cars moving slowly on a road. It becomes unfair or the worst or ruining my day only when we compare it to an imagined version of the morning where everything went smoothly. The gap between the imagined morning and the real one, that gap is where the suffering lives. And Marcus Aurelius, sitting in his tent, surrounded by far greater hardships than any of us are likely to face, had learned to close that gap before it ever opened. Now let's meet someone else, perhaps someone you might recognize, perhaps even in yourself. Her name doesn't matter, because her story belongs to millions of people. She is the person who feels deep down that no one really understands her. At work, her ideas get overlooked in meetings, and then somehow, a few days later, someone else suggests something similar and receives praise for it. At home, she tries to explain how she feels, and the people closest to her respond with confusion, or worse, with dismissiveness. "You're overreacting. It's not that big a deal." Online, she sees other people's lives, their vacations, their achievements, their seemingly effortless relationships, and feels a quiet ache, a sense that she is somehow invisible, that her efforts and her inner world simply don't register with the people around her. This feeling of being misunderstood is one of the most painful experiences a human being can have, because it touches something deep, our need to be seen, to matter, to have our existence acknowledged by others. And so naturally, she complains. Not always loudly. Sometimes it's just a sigh, a comment muttered under her breath, a sarcastic remark dropped into conversation. "No one ever listens to me. It's like I'm talking to a wall. Why do I even bother explaining myself anymore?" Each of these complaints feels justified. Each of them is, in a sense, true. She really does feel unheard. But here is where the Stoic perspective offers something that at first might sound almost uncomfortable. Marcus Aurelius, the most powerful man in the world, the emperor whose word could end lives or build cities, faced something remarkably similar. Throughout his journal, he writes about people who criticize him, misjudge his intentions, and fail to appreciate what he does. And his response is not to demand that they change. His response is something far more radical. He reminds himself that it is simply not in his power to make other people understand him. He cannot reach into their minds and rearrange their perceptions. What he can control is whether he continues to act with integrity, regardless of whether anyone notices or approves. This is not the same as giving up on being understood. It is something subtler. It is releasing your peace of mind from being dependent on something you cannot control. Think about how much of our daily emotional energy is spent trying to manage other people's perceptions of us. We rehearse conversations in our heads, defending ourselves against criticisms that haven't even been spoken yet. We feel wounded by misunderstandings, and then we feel wounded again by the fact that we feel wounded, layering frustration on top of frustration. The Stoics noticed something that feels almost paradoxical. The more desperately we need to be understood, the more painful every misunderstanding becomes. But the moment we stop making our peace conditional on other people's perceptions, without becoming cold or withdrawn, but simply releasing that particular grip, something shifts. The misunderstanding is still there, but it no longer has the same power over us. But this raises a question that might already be forming in your mind. Doesn't this just mean accepting being treated unfairly? Doesn't it mean staying silent forever, letting people walk all over you? This is one of the most common misunderstandings about Stoicism, and it deserves a real answer, because the truth is far more empowering than simple acceptance, and it has everything to do with where your attention goes once a complaint forms. Let's turn to another familiar feeling, the slow, grinding frustration of progress that refuses to come. Picture someone who has been working toward a goal for months, maybe years. They've been trying to build a business, or lose weight, or learn a new skill, or save money for something important. They wake up every day and do the work, and yet when they look at where they are compared to where they wanted to be, the gap seems to mock them. They scroll through social media and see someone their age who seems to have it all figured out. The promotion, the body, the relationship, the lifestyle. And a quiet voice whispers, "What am I doing wrong? Why does everything take so long for me?" This frustration often turns into a particular kind of complaint. Not loud, not dramatic, but corrosive. "I've been trying for so long and nothing is happening. Other people get lucky breaks and I just keep grinding with no results. Maybe I'm just not cut out for this." These thoughts feel like honest assessments, but notice what they actually do. They don't speed up progress. They don't reveal a faster path. What they do is drain the very energy needed to continue. They are, in a sense, complaints directed not at the world, but at time itself.
And time, more than almost anything else, is something the Stoics thought about with extraordinary clarity. Seneca, the Roman statesman, playwright, and advisor to emperors, wrote one of the most famous essays in all of philosophy on exactly this subject. He observed something that should stop us in our tracks. People are fiercely protective of their money, their property, their possessions, and yet they give away their time, the one truly irreplaceable resource, as if it were worthless. We complain when someone wastes 5 minutes of our time in a pointless meeting, and yet we will spend hours scrolling through other people's lives, comparing our pace to theirs, feeling sorry for ourselves about how slow our own journey is. And in doing so, we waste the very time we could be using to move forward.
Here's the deeper insight, the one that completely reframes the experience of slow progress. Seneca didn't believe that life was short because of how many years we get. He believed life feels short and is effectively shortened by how much of it we spend not truly living, not truly present, not truly engaged with what matters. A person who spends 2 hours each evening anxiously comparing their progress to others, feeling resentful about how slow things are going, has not used those 2 hours to think, rest, create, connect, or grow. Multiply that by months and years, and you begin to see how much of a life can quietly leak away, not through dramatic events, but through the slow drip of comparison and complaint. And here is the paradox that changes everything. The feeling of being behind is not actually a measurement of your progress. It is a story constructed by comparing your full, complicated, behind-the-scenes reality to someone else's curated, simplified highlight reel. Seneca, writing to his friend Lucilius, often returned to a single theme, that almost no one is actually paying attention to the things that truly matter, because they're too busy comparing, complaining, and waiting for some future moment when things will finally be good enough to start truly living. But that future moment never arrives on its own. It has to be claimed today, in the middle of the very frustration that feels like it's holding you back. What happened next in Seneca's own life revealed a truth that completely changed the way he viewed time and progress. Because Seneca did not write about patience from a position of comfort. He wrote it while living under the rule of Emperor Nero, a man capable of extraordinary cruelty who would eventually order Seneca's own death. Seneca knew, better than most, that time could be cut short at any moment by forces entirely outside his control. And rather than this making him anxious or bitter about lost time, it did the opposite. It made him fiercely protective of the present moment, refusing to let it be consumed by resentment about a past that couldn't be changed or anxiety about a future that might never come. Now let's talk about betrayal. Because almost everyone at some point in their life experiences the particular sting of being wronged by someone they trusted. Maybe it was a business partner who took credit for your work, or a friend who spread rumors behind your back, or a romantic partner who broke a promise that felt sacred. Betrayal cuts deeper than almost any other wound because it doesn't just hurt in the moment, it rewrites the past. Suddenly, memories that once felt warm and genuine become suspect. You find yourself replaying conversations, looking for clues you missed, wondering how much of the relationship was ever real. And from this wound, complaints grow easily and understandably. I can't believe they did this to me. After everything I did for them, I'll never trust anyone again. These complaints feel completely justified, and in many cases they are accurate descriptions of what happened. The Stoics never asked anyone to pretend that betrayal didn't hurt, or that the person who betrayed them did nothing wrong. That would be undishonest, and Stoicism at its core is deeply committed to honesty, especially honesty about reality as it actually is, not as we wish it were. But there's a second layer to betrayal that most people never examine, and it's this second layer that determines whether the wound heals or festers for years.
Seneca experienced betrayal on a scale most of us will never face. He spent years in exile, banished from Rome on accusations that were almost certainly politically motivated rather than true. Later in his life, he served as advisor and tutor to Nero, a young man Seneca had personally helped shape, only to watch that same young man become increasingly paranoid, cruel, and dangerous. Eventually, Seneca found himself implicated in a plot against the very emperor he had once mentored and was ordered to take his own life. Whether or not Seneca was actually involved in the plot remains debated by historians to this day, but what is not debated is the betrayal he must have felt watching a person he had poured years of guidance and care into become the instrument of his death.
And yet, in his writings, Seneca doesn't dwell in bitterness. He doesn't spend pages cataloging the wrongs done to him. Instead, he returns again and again to a single piercing question. What does dwelling on this betrayal actually do for me? Does it undo what happened? Does it change the other person's character? Or does it simply mean that the person who wronged me gets to keep hurting me indefinitely every single time I replay it in my mind? This is the second layer of betrayal, the part that is actually within our control. The original act of betrayal happened once in the past, and it cannot be undone. But the replaying, the resentment, the mental rehearsal of how could they do this to me, that happens over and over in the present, and it is something we are doing to ourselves, often without realizing it. The Stoics weren't saying the betrayal didn't matter. They were saying that there is a difference between the wound itself and the way we keep reopening it. Yet this is where the story becomes even more surprising, because the Stoics took this idea one step further than most people are comfortable with. Marcus Aurelius wrote about people who do wrong, who lie, cheat, betray, and harm others, not with hatred, but almost with a kind of sorrowful understanding. He observed that people who act badly are usually acting out of their own confusion, their own pain, their own distorted sense of what will make them happy. This doesn't excuse the harm they cause, but it changes the emotional charge of the betrayal. Instead of, how could they do this to me? The question becomes, what must be going on inside someone that leads them to act this way? And notice, this isn't about the betrayer at all, not really. It's about freeing yourself from a story that keeps you bound to someone who in many cases has already moved on with their life, while you remain anchored to the moment they wronged you. There is another quiet complaint that lives in the hearts of many people, one that rarely gets spoken aloud because it feels almost embarrassing to admit, the feeling of simply being unlucky. Not unlucky in any single dramatic event, but unlucky in a general, ongoing sense, as if life handed out advantages to some people and somehow forgot to include you on the list. Some people just have it easy. I was born into the wrong circumstances. If I had their starting point, I'd be so much further along by now. This feeling is deeply human, and it's worth pausing on because it touches something the Stoics thought about constantly, the role of fortune, what they called tyche, in human life. The Stoics were not naive about the fact that life is unequal. They lived in a world of staggering inequality, where some were born into immense wealth and others into slavery, where a single decision of an emperor could elevate a family for generations or destroy it overnight. They knew, perhaps better than we do, just how much of life is shaped by circumstances no one chooses. But here is the insight that reframes everything. Seneca often compared fortune to someone who lends you things rather than gives them to you. Wealth, status, health, relationships, even your own body. All of these are, in Seneca's view, things you have been lent for a time, not things you fundamentally own. A person who is born wealthy has not won anything permanent. They have simply been lent more for now, and what is lent can be recalled at any moment, by illness, by misfortune, by the simple passage of time. A person who is born with fewer resources has been lent less for now, but the same impermanence applies to everyone, regardless of where they started. This isn't meant to dismiss real inequality or to suggest that circumstances don't matter. They clearly do. But it shifts the question away from why didn't I get what they got and towards something far more useful. What am I doing with what has been lent to me? Because here's what's easy to miss when we're caught in the comparison trap. The person who seems to have it easy is dealing with their own version of this story right now in their own head. Maybe they're comparing themselves to someone even more fortunate. Maybe the ease you see from the outside is hiding struggles you can't see. Family conflict, health issues, an inner emptiness that no amount of inherited advantage can fill. The comparison game has no finish line because there is always someone who appears to have more. Marcus Aurelius, born into one of the most privileged positions a human being could occupy, eventual ruler of the known world, spent a remarkable amount of time reminding himself not to be impressed by status, wealth, or apparent good fortune, whether his own or anyone else's. He had seen up close that emperors could be murdered by their own guards, that wealth could be seized overnight by political shifts, that health could be destroyed by a single illness, regardless of how many palaces a person owned. He understood that fortune, by its very nature, is something that comes and goes, and that building your sense of worth on something that comes and goes is, in his words, like building a house on sand and then being shocked when the tide comes in. So what then is something that doesn't come and go? What is something that cannot be redistributed by fortune, taken by a thief, or lost in a market crash? This question leads us to one of the most important and most misunderstood ideas in the entire Stoic tradition, and it's the same idea that allowed people to maintain their dignity even in the very worst circumstances life can offer. Let's sit with one more scenario, because this one might be the most familiar of all. The experience of being trapped in negativity, where complaining has stopped being an occasional release and has become a kind of atmosphere, a fog that follows a person from room to room. You probably know someone like this, or perhaps on certain days you recognize this pattern in yourself. Every conversation seems to circle back to what's wrong, the job that's unfair, the friends who don't make enough effort, the body that won't cooperate, the world that seems determined to disappoint. And the strange thing is, the complaints are often individually completely valid. The job might genuinely be unfair, the friends might genuinely be distant, but something has happened where these individual grievances have merged into a single continuous narrative. Life is against me and it's exhausting. What's happening here psychologically is something the Stoics intuited long before modern psychology gave it a name. Every time we complain about something, we are, in a small way, rehearsing it, strengthening the neural pathway that associates that situation with frustration, injustice, and helplessness. The brain doesn't distinguish very well between thinking about a problem in order to solve it and thinking about a problem in order to feel bad about it again. Both feel like the brain is doing something about the issue, but only one of them actually moves anything forward. The other simply deepens a groove, like a record needle wearing the same track over and over until that track becomes the loudest, most familiar sound the mind knows how to make. Marcus Aurelius wrote about something he called dying the soul, the idea that the thoughts we repeatedly engage with don't just pass through us, they color us, the way a fabric takes on the color of the dye it repeatedly soaked in. A mind that spends most of its time in grievance doesn't just feel grievance during the complaining, it begins to perceive the entire world through a grievance-tinted lens. Neutral comments start to sound like insults, minor inconveniences start to feel like personal attacks. The fog doesn't just sit over the bad moments, it seeps into the good ones too, making it harder to notice them, harder to feel grateful, harder to feel anything except the low hum of "this is unfair."
Here's where the story takes an unexpected turn, though.
Because the way out of this fog is not what most people assume. It's not about forcing positivity, plastering on a smile, or telling yourself that everything is actually fine when it isn't. The Stoics would have found that approach almost as dishonest and almost as harmful as constant complaint, because it's just another way of avoiding what's actually true. The way out, instead, begins with a small, almost imperceptible shift, the moment between something happening and your reaction to it. Epictetus described this gap using one of the most quoted ideas in all of Stoic philosophy, the idea that it is never the event itself that disturbs us, but our judgment about the event. A traffic jam doesn't contain frustration inside it, the way a box might contain an object. The frustration is added by us in the moment we judge the traffic jam as ruining my day, rather than simply traffic. A critical comment from a coworker doesn't contain humiliation inside it. The humiliation is added by the judgment, this means I'm not good enough. Once you see this gap, even just once, even for a moment, you start to notice it everywhere. And noticing it is the first step towards something the Stoics considered one of the highest forms of personal power, the ability to choose your response rather than have it chosen for you by whatever happens to occur. This brings us to a question that might be quietly forming by now. If complaining doesn't actually help, and if the Stoics knew this 2,000 years ago, why does almost everyone still do it? Why does this habit persist so universally across cultures, across centuries, in nearly every human being who has ever lived? The answer to this question is one of the most important parts of this entire story because it reveals something about complaining that almost no one talks about. When we complain, especially to someone who listens sympathetically, something happens in the brain that resembles a small reward. We feel validated. We feel like our pain has been witnessed, acknowledged, confirmed as real. There's a reason venting to a friend after a hard day can feel so satisfying. It's not because the problem has been solved, but because we've received a small dose of social connection and validation, and the brain registers that as relief. But here's the catch, and it's a catch the Stoics understood with remarkable precision, even without the language of modern neuroscience. That relief is temporary, and it comes at a cost. Every time we complain and receive that small hit of validation, we are training our brain to associate talking about the problem in a frustrated way with feeling better. Which means the next time something frustrating happens, the brain's first instinct is not, how do I solve this, but who can I tell about this so I can get that relief again? Over time, this can create something close to a dependency, not on the complaining itself, but on the relief it provides, which means the underlying problem rarely gets the kind of attention that would actually resolve it. This is why people can complain about the same issue, a difficult relationship, a stagnant career, a health habit they keep promising to change for years, sometimes decades, without it ever actually changing. It's not that they don't want change, it's that the complaining itself has become a substitute for the change, providing just enough relief to make the underlying problem bearable, which paradoxically makes it less likely to be solved, because the pressure that might have driven real action keeps getting released a little bit at a time through words. The Stoics offered something different, not the suppression of feeling, but a redirection of where that energy goes. When something frustrating happens, instead of asking, who can I complain to about this, the Stoic question becomes, what is within my power to do about this right now with what I have? Sometimes the honest answer is nothing. This is simply something I have to endure. And in those cases, the Stoics believed in enduring with dignity, without dramatizing the suffering further by adding layers of resentment on top of it. But often, when we actually ask this question honestly, we discover that there is something within our power, even if it's small, even if it's just the single next step. And taking that step, however small, produces a feeling fundamentally different from the temporary relief of complaint. It produces a sense of agency. And agency, unlike the relief of venting, tends to compound. Each small action taken builds confidence for the next one, while each complaint voiced without action tends to deepen the groove of helplessness just a little bit further. This is also where we arrive at one of the most foundational distinctions in all of Stoic thought, a distinction that once understood changes the entire emotional landscape of a person's life. It's the difference between pain and suffering. Pain is real. Pain is what happens when your body is injured, when you lose someone you love, when your circumstances genuinely fall apart. The Stoics never denied pain, and any philosophy that asked you to pretend pain doesn't exist would be a philosophy built on denial, not wisdom. Marcus Aurelius lost multiple children during his lifetime, in an era when child mortality was devastatingly common, but no less heartbreaking for being common. He felt that loss. He was human. Seneca, in his letters, writes with real tenderness about grief, about the way loss can hollow out a person for a time. The Stoics were not asking anyone to feel nothing, but suffering, the kind of suffering that stretches pain across days, months, and years, that turns a single painful event into a permanent lens through which everything else gets viewed. Suffering, in the Stoic view, is largely something the mind adds on top of pain. Think of it this way. Pain is the actual injury. Suffering is the story we tell about the injury. This shouldn't have happened to me. I'll never recover from this. This proves that life is unfair. This means something is fundamentally wrong with me or my life. These additional layers don't change the original injury at all. They simply multiply it, spreading it across time and into areas of life the original injury never even touched. There's an image that captures this perfectly, one that has been used by various wisdom traditions throughout history, though the Stoics arrived at something remarkably similar through their own reasoning. Imagine being struck by an arrow. That's the pain, sharp, real, undeniable. Now imagine that in your shock and anger about being struck, you pick up a second arrow and strike yourself with it, again and again, asking, "Why me? Why did this happen? This isn't fair. I can't believe this." The first arrow was not your doing. The second arrow, the repeated self-inflicted wound of resentment, rumination, and why me, that one, you're holding yourself. This is not a subtle distinction once you start looking for it in your own life. Think about the last time something went wrong. Maybe you made a mistake at work, or said something you regretted, or experienced a setback you didn't see coming. The first arrow was the event itself, the mistake, the awkward moment, the setback. But how much time did you spend afterward replaying it, berating yourself, imagining worst-case scenarios about what people now thought of you, lying awake rehearsing what you should have said instead? That replaying, that's the second arrow. And here's what makes this so important. The first arrow often lasts seconds, or at most a difficult day. The second arrow, if left unchecked, can last for years. Epictetus put this in terms that feel almost shockingly direct even today. He taught his students to practice distinguishing in real time between "this is what happened" and "this is what I am telling myself about what happened." Someone insults you, that's an event. "I am worthless and everyone thinks so," that's a story built on top of the event, and it's a story you have the power to examine, question, and ultimately choose not to believe. This doesn't mean forcing yourself to feel happy about being insulted. It means recognizing that the insult itself is just sound, just words moving through air, and everything beyond that, the meaning, the implication, the verdict about your worth as a person, is something you are adding, and therefore something you can also choose not to add. But here's a question worth sitting with for a moment, because it cuts right to the heart of why complaining is so seductive in the moment. If complaints don't actually solve problems, and if they often make suffering worse rather than better, why do they feel in the moment like such an important use of our attention? The answer has to do with where your attention actually goes when you complain, and once you see it, you'll start noticing it everywhere. Attention is one of the most valuable resources a human being has, and yet almost no one budgets it the way we budget money or time. Every moment of every day, your attention is going somewhere, and wherever it goes, it tends to grow.
This isn't mysticism, it's simply how perception and motivation work. The things you pay attention to become the things that feel most real, most urgent, most significant. And complaining, by its very nature, is an act of pouring attention into a problem in a very particular way, a way that emphasizes how bad the problem is, how unfair it is, how stuck you are, rather than what could be done about it. Picture two people who experience the exact same setback. Let's say both of them apply for the same promotion and both get rejected. The first person spends the next several days talking to anyone who will listen about how unfair the decision was, how the company doesn't appreciate good work, how the person who got the promotion is less qualified, how this confirms a pattern of being overlooked. Every conversation, every quiet moment becomes an opportunity to revisit the injustice. The second person feels the disappointment just as intensely, maybe even more intensely because they don't talk about it as much. But after allowing themselves to feel it, they ask a different question. What can I learn from this? What would make me a stronger candidate next time? Is there feedback I can request? Is this actually the right path for me? Or is this disappointment pointing me towards something else?
6 months later, look at where these two people are. The first person, having spent their attention on the unfairness of the situation, has likely changed very little. Their skills are the same, their relationships at work may have subtly shifted as colleagues grow tired of the complaints, and their sense of being overlooked has, if anything, deepened because they've spent months reinforcing it. The second person, having directed their attention toward what could be learned and what could be done, has likely taken some action, even if it was small, and that action has likely opened some kind of door, even a small one, that wouldn't have existed otherwise. This is what it means to say that complaints steal attention from solutions, not in some abstract moralistic sense, but in a very literal, almost mechanical sense. Attention is finite. Every minute spent narrating the unfairness of a situation is a minute not spent doing something about it, or accepting it, or moving past it. And here's the part that's easy to miss. This isn't about ignoring injustice or pretending problems don't exist. The Stoics were deeply engaged with the world. Marcus Aurelius ruled an empire. Seneca advised emperors and wrote extensively about ethics and justice. Epictetus taught students how to live well in an unjust world. They were not passive, but their engagement was directed outward toward action rather than inward toward rumination. Yet this is where the story becomes even more surprising, because there's a deeper question hiding underneath all of this, one that gets to the very root of why we complain in the first place. And it has to do with something most people have never been taught to do: distinguish between what they can change and what they simply have to carry. There's a practice that runs through almost everything the Stoics wrote, though they expressed it in different ways. Marcus Aurelius called it accepting what is given to you with grace. Later Stoic-influenced thinkers called it amor fati, a love of fate, an embrace of whatever happens, not because everything that happens is good, but because resisting what has already occurred is a battle you can never win. The event has already occurred. The only question that remains is what you do with the moment you're actually in, right now, as it actually is. This might sound like passive resignation, but it's almost the opposite. Resignation says, nothing I do matters, so why bother? Acceptance, in the Stoic sense, says this is the actual situation I'm in, so let me direct all of my energy toward what I can do within it, rather than wasting energy wishing it were a different situation. Imagine someone caught in a sudden rainstorm without an umbrella. Resignation looks like standing there, getting soaked, complaining about the rain, doing nothing. Acceptance looks like immediately recognizing I'm going to get wet, this is the situation, and then making the best decision available, finding shelter, moving quickly, protecting what needs to be protected. The rain is the same in both cases. The experience of the person standing in it is completely different. Gratitude works in a similar way, though it operates on a slightly different axis. While acceptance deals with what's happening right now, gratitude deals with what's already here, often not noticed, because our attention has been captured by what's missing.
The person who feels unlucky that we talked about earlier, comparing themselves to others who seem to have more, is in a very real sense looking at their life through a frame that highlights absence. Gratitude denies that absence, but it widens the frame, and in widening it, it often reveals just how much is actually present that was simply never being looked at. Marcus Aurelius, in the middle of a journal otherwise filled with reminders about difficulty, criticism, and the inevitability of death, repeatedly returns to a kind of grounded appreciation for his teachers, for the people who showed him kindness, for the simple fact of being alive at all, in a body that, despite everything, still functions, still allows him to think, to write, to act. This wasn't naive positivity. This was a man who had every reason to feel burdened, choosing deliberately to notice what was actually there, rather than only what was missing.
Here's why this matters so much in the context of complaining. Complaining and gratitude cannot occupy the same moment. They are, in a sense, opposite directions of attention. One points toward what's wrong, missing, or unfair, and the other points toward what's present, functioning, or given. This doesn't mean forcing gratitude as a way of suppressing real problems. That would just be another form of avoidance. But it does mean that a person who has trained themselves to notice what's present, even in the middle of difficulty, has access to a kind of psychological ground to stand on that the person who only notices what's missing simply doesn't have. And from that ground, problems can actually be addressed because the person addressing them isn't also drowning in a sense of overall deprivation. This brings us to something that might be the single most practical insight in this entire story, because everything we've discussed so far could still leave a person feeling like Stoicism is something that happens to you, a kind of grace that some people have and others don't. But the truth is the opposite. The truth is that self-mastery isn't something you're born with. It's something that begins the moment you stop doing one very specific thing, something almost everyone does every single day, often without realizing it. That one thing is making excuses. And before any judgment creeps in here, it's worth saying clearly, making excuses is one of the most natural, most universal, most deeply human things we do. It's not a sign of weakness or moral failure. It's a kind of psychological self-protection, a way of explaining away outcomes that don't match our self-image so that our sense of who we are remains intact. I didn't get the job because they already had someone in mind. I didn't finish the project because I've just been so busy. I haven't started because the timing isn't right yet. Sometimes these explanations are even partially true. The problem isn't that they're always false. The problem is what they do to our relationship with our own power. Epictetus taught something that even now feels almost shockingly direct. He drew a hard line between things that are up to us and things that are not up to us, and he asked his students to apply this line ruthlessly, especially to themselves. Did you genuinely do everything within your power with the resources you actually had in the time you actually had? If the honest answer is yes, then there's nothing more to examine. The outcome was simply not within your control, and dwelling on it further is pointless. But if the honest answer is not entirely, if there's a version of events where you tried a little harder, started a little sooner, asked for help a little earlier, then the question becomes not why didn't this work out, but what does this tell me about what I'm capable of doing differently next time? This is uncomfortable, and it's meant to be, but notice what it does. It takes the question away from external circumstances, away from luck, away from other people, and places it squarely back in the one place where change is actually possible, your own choices, starting from this moment forward. An excuse, no matter how valid it sounds, has one unavoidable effect. It closes the door on that question. It says, in effect, this had nothing to do with me, so there's nothing for me to learn or change here. And a door that's closed cannot be walked through, no matter how much energy is spent standing outside it, explaining why it's closed.
Here's the surprising part, though, the part that turns this from a harsh judgment into something genuinely freeing. When you stop making excuses, you don't actually feel worse about yourself, even though it might seem like admitting fault should feel that way. What actually happens is something closer to relief, because as long as the outcome is someone else's fault, or bad luck, or bad timing, you are, in a strange way, powerless. You're at the mercy of forces outside yourself. But the moment you take responsibility, even for something painful, even for something embarrassing, you reclaim the one thing that was never actually taken away from you, your own agency going forward. Marcus Aurelius wrote in the privacy of his own journal about his own failures, moments of anger, impatience, lapses in judgment. He didn't write about these things to torture himself, and he certainly wasn't writing for an audience that would judge him. He wrote about them because naming a failure honestly, without excuse, is the first and necessary step towards not repeating it. An emperor, accountable to almost no one, voluntarily held himself accountable in private with no one watching, because he understood that the habit of honest self-examination, practiced consistently, is what separates a person who slowly improves over a lifetime from a person who stays exactly the same while blaming an ever-growing list of external factors. And this leads us to perhaps the deepest question of all, the one that, if you let it sink in fully, can change not just how you respond to difficulties, but how you experience reality itself. Here is the question: if two people can experience the exact same event, the same rude comment, the same traffic jam, the same piece of bad news, and walk away with completely different emotional experiences, where exactly is the misery located? Is it in the event itself? If it were, then everyone exposed to that event would feel exactly the same thing to exactly the same degree, every single time. But that's not what happens. The same event lands differently on different people, and even on the same person on different days, which means the event itself cannot be the source of the misery. The misery has to be located somewhere else, and the only place left to look is in the mind that's experiencing the event. This might sound like a small philosophical technicality, but its implications are enormous, because it means that the source of almost all of your emotional suffering is not out there in the world where you have very limited control. It's in here, in the way you're interpreting and reacting to what's out there, which is precisely the one domain where you have, as the Stoics insisted, complete and total control, even when nothing else in your life feels controllable.
Marcus Aurelius wrote something that, once understood, almost feels like a key turning in a lock. The obstacle that seems to be standing in your way can actually become the way forward, because the very act of facing the obstacle, working with it, adapting to it, becomes the next step of your path. There is no separate path that exists somewhere else, free of obstacles that you've somehow been denied access to. The path is made of obstacles. That's not a flaw in the journey, that is the journey. Think about how differently this reframes a difficult day at work, a frustrating relationship conflict, a financial setback, a health scare. In our normal way of thinking, these things feel like interruptions, pauses in real life that we have to get through before real life can resume. But the Stoic view suggests something almost vertigo-inducing. There is no real life waiting on the other side of these difficulties. This is real life. The difficult conversation, the financial pressure, the health concern, these aren't standing between you and your life. They are your life right now, and the only question that matters is how you're going to meet them. This doesn't mean every difficulty is secretly a blessing, or that we should be grateful for every hardship as if it were a gift wrapped in disguise. That kind of forced positivity would be its own form of dishonesty. What it means is something more grounded, that your emotional experience of any given moment is not handed to you by the moment itself. It's something you participate in creating through the lens you bring to it.
And once you know that you're participating in creating it, you can no longer fully blame the moment for how it feels, which is uncomfortable, but also strangely liberating, because it means the next moment is not predetermined either. It's still being written by you right now. This idea that perception shapes experience connects to something else the Stoics value deeply, something that in our current world of constant noise, constant opinions, constant reactions posted within seconds of anything happening, feels almost radical. And it has to do with what you choose not to say. We live in a culture that often treats silence as weakness or as something suspicious. If you don't react, if you don't defend yourself, if you don't immediately broadcast your side of the story, it can feel like you're letting people believe whatever they want about you. And yet, the Stoics, who lived in a world every bit as politically charged and socially competitive as ours, often pointed to silence and restraint as among the highest expressions of strength. Not because speaking up is bad, but because the impulse to react instantly to every slight, to every criticism, to every piece of bad news is itself a kind of vulnerability, a sign that something outside of you has reached in and pulled a string and you danced. Epictetus used an image that has stayed relevant for 2,000 years. Imagine your mind as a kind of guarded space, and imagine that every event, every comment, every piece of news that reaches you is like someone knocking at the door of that space, asking to be let in. Most people leave the door wide open all the time, so that anything, a stranger's rude comment, a piece of gossip, a minor inconvenience, walks straight in and starts rearranging the furniture, disturbing the peace of the entire household. The Stoic practice is not to never let anything in. That would mean cutting yourself off from life entirely. It's to become the one who decides what gets let in and what's simply acknowledged at the door and allowed to pass by. When you respond to every criticism, every provocation, every piece of bad news with an immediate, visible reaction, when you complain loudly, defend yourself instantly, explain yourself at length to anyone who will listen, you are, in a very real sense, handing over the keys to that space. The other person or the situation gets to determine your emotional state for the next several minutes, hours, or even days. But the person who can receive a difficult comment, feel its sting internally, and then choose deliberately whether and how to respond, rather than reacting automatically, has kept the keys. They've kept something that in the moment might look like nothing at all from the outside, just a pause, a breath, a quiet moment, but which is, in fact, one of the most powerful things a person can hold on to. This doesn't mean Stoics never spoke up, never set boundaries, never corrected injustice. Marcus Aurelius issued edicts, made decisions, governed an empire. He was not a passive man. Seneca wrote essays meant to persuade, to teach, to change minds. He was not silent. But there's a difference between speech that comes from a place of considered choice and speech that comes from a place of reactive compulsion. The difference between, I am choosing to address this because it matters and I have something useful to contribute, and I cannot bear to let this go unanswered for even one more second. The first comes from strength. The second, however justified it might feel, often comes from a kind of inner agitation that the Stoics spent their entire lives learning to recognize and quiet. And this brings us, finally, to the deepest layer of this entire story. The question of why exactly the Stoics saw adversity itself in such a radically different light than most people do. Because everything we've discussed so far, the gap between event and reaction, the difference between pain and suffering, the power of attention, the practice of gratitude, the end of excuses, the strength of silence, all of it builds towards a single transformative way of relating to difficulty itself, one that doesn't just help you cope with hard times, but actually changes what hard times mean.
Consider once more the life of Marcus Aurelius, not as a list of titles and dates, but as a human story. He became emperor at a time when the Roman Empire was beginning to face pressures it had never fully experienced before. Within a few years of taking power, a devastating plague swept through the empire, carried back by soldiers returning from campaigns in the east. Entire cities lost significant portions of their populations. No one, including the emperor himself, was guaranteed safety. At the same time, hostile forces pressed against the empire's borders, requiring Marcus to spend years of his life not in the comfort of Rome's palaces, but in military camps along frontiers, dealing with the brutal logistics of war, disease among soldiers, and the constant threat of betrayal from within his own ranks. At one point, a trusted general did, in fact, attempt to seize power while Marcus was occupied elsewhere. On top of all of this, Marcus Aurelius experienced what may be one of the most universally devastating human experiences. He outlived several of his own children. In an era without modern medicine, child mortality was tragically common, but commonness never makes grief smaller. He carried this loss while still being expected to govern, to make decisions affecting millions of lives, to project stability to an empire that was, in many ways, under siege from multiple directions at once. Now, here is the question worth sitting with. If anyone in history had a right to complain, to feel that life had been unfair, that the universe had singled him out for suffering despite his power and position, it was this man. And yet, the writings he left behind, written for no audience but himself, contain remarkably little complaint. What they contain instead is something the Stoics referred to, in various ways, as training. The idea of training is worth unpacking because it's not just a comforting reframe, it reflects something the Stoics genuinely believed about the structure of a meaningful life. An athlete who only ever lifts light weights never becomes strong. A musician who only ever plays simple pieces never develops mastery. In every domain where humans develop real capability, difficulty isn't an obstacle to development, it is the mechanism of development. The muscle doesn't grow despite the resistance, it grows because of it. The musician's skill doesn't develop despite the difficult pieces, it develops through wrestling with them. The Stoics extended this idea to character itself. Courage cannot be developed in the absence of fear. It can only be developed by facing fear and acting anyway. Patience cannot be developed in the absence of frustration. It can only be developed by experiencing frustration and choosing not to be ruled by it. Compassion cannot be developed in the absence of suffering. It can only be developed by encountering suffering in yourself or others and choosing to respond with care rather than indifference. Which means that the very difficulties that feel like interruptions to a good life are in fact the only available training ground for the qualities that make a life good in the first place. This doesn't mean the Stoics went looking for suffering, or that they believed more hardship automatically makes a person better. Plenty of people are crushed by hardship rather than strengthened by it, and the Stoics knew this too. The difference lies in how the hardship is met. A weight that's too heavy lifted with poor form doesn't build strength, it causes injury. The training only works if there's a framework for engaging with the difficulty productively rather than simply being flattened by it. And that framework, the dichotomy of control, the gap between event and judgment, the distinction between pain and suffering, the redirection of attention from complaint to action, the practice of gratitude for what remains even amid loss, that framework is precisely what the Stoics spent their lives developing, refining, and teaching, because they understood that adversity was coming for everyone, with or without warning, and that the time to build the framework was before it arrived, not after. Epictetus, who had quite literally been broken by other people, enslaved, injured, stripped of every external freedom, became paradoxically one of the freest men of his era, teaching students who included some of the wealthiest and most powerful people in Rome, people who, despite having everything Epictetus lacked, came to him because they sensed he had something they didn't, a kind of unshakable inner ground that no circumstance, no matter how severe, seemed to take away.
And now we arrive at the heart of everything, the single insight that ties together every scenario we've explored, every story, every paradox. It's the realization that complaining and personal power cannot coexist in the same moment because they point in opposite directions. To complain is to say, in effect, something out there is responsible for how I feel, and I am waiting for it to change before I can feel differently. To respond as a Stoic, not perfectly, not without feeling, but deliberately, is to say, I feel what I feel, and within that feeling I still have a choice about what happens next, and that choice is mine, regardless of what's happening out there. This is not a small reframe. It is, in many ways, the most fundamental shift a human mind can make. The shift from seeing yourself as something that happens to be present while life acts on you, to seeing yourself as an active participant in your own experience, with a role to play no matter what circumstances arrive. And here's what's remarkable. This shift doesn't require your circumstances to change at all. The traffic is still traffic. The difficult person is still difficult. The setback is still a setback. But the person experiencing these things is no longer the same person because they've stopped waiting for permission from the world to feel okay.
Think back to every scenario we walked through. The person who feels misunderstood doesn't need everyone to suddenly understand them in order to feel whole. They can act with integrity and let their sense of self rest on something more stable than other people's perceptions. The person frustrated by slow progress doesn't need to suddenly arrive at their destination in order to feel at peace. They can recognize that the present moment, used well, is the only material from which any future is ever built. The person who has experienced betrayal doesn't need the betrayer to apologize or even to acknowledge what they did in order to stop carrying the weight. They can recognize that continuing to carry it serves no one, least of all themselves. The person who feels unlucky doesn't need to suddenly become luckier. They can recognize that what's been lent to them, however much or little, is theirs to use starting now. And the person trapped in negativity doesn't need their circumstances to transform overnight. They can begin today with a single moment of noticing the gap between what happened and what they're telling themselves about what happened. You don't have to be perfect. You don't have to silence every frustration forever. But in that small pause, you have access to something the Stoics discovered, lived, and tried to pass on across thousands of years. The realization that no one and nothing can take away your ability to choose how you meet this moment. Not traffic, not critics, not betrayal, not bad luck, not even loss. That ability has always been yours, quietly waiting underneath every complaint you've ever made. If this journey gave you even one new way of seeing your own struggles, that's exactly what it was meant to do, and there's more where this came from. If you found value in this, take a moment to like this video. It genuinely helps this message reach more people who need to hear it. Subscribe to Wisdom of Stoic so you don't miss the next journey into timeless wisdom that can change the way you live. If you know someone who's been carrying a heavy complaint, a grudge, a frustration that's been weighing on them, share this with them. Sometimes the right words at the right moment can shift everything. And before you go, leave a comment below with one insight from this video that meant something to you, or one thing you're going to try letting go of starting today. Your reflection might be exactly what someone else needs to read. Thank you for spending this time on the pursuit of a calmer, stronger, more powerful way of living. And until next time, remember, the obstacle was never really the enemy. It was always the invitation.